everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our 4th annual 19th Represents Summit. I'm Amanda Zamora, co-founder and publisher of the 19th. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're exploring gender and racial equality and justice, whether in the courtroom or in our day-to-day lives. We'll hear from leaders about the fight for justice and what a more just and equitable world could look like. Before we begin, I want to thank those who've made this week possible, including our founding sponsors, the National Women's Law Center and Stardust Fund, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation and the Tory Burch Foundation. We'd also like to thank our national media partner, The Washington Post, as well as our local media partners, Block Club Chicago, CityCast Chicago, City Bureau, and the Chicago Independent Media Alliance. And finally, thanks to our academic partner, Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. A quick note that while sponsors help to keep the 19th Represents free for all viewers to attend, they play no part in our event programming. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our first conversation of the day with New York Attorney General Letitia James.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation on racial and gender equity in the justice system. I'm Brianna Tucker, Deputy Politics Editor for Next Gen at The Washington Post, and it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest for this keynote, the Honorable Letitia James, Attorney General of the State of New York. As the first Black woman and woman of color to hold this position, Attorney General James is a trailblazer who has focused her career on social justice, equity, and fairness. So you've mentioned in interviews that when you were a teenager, you spent many days in a courtroom watching your brother go through the legal system over a false bike theft accusation, and how none of the lawyers looked like you, but nearly all of the defendants did. Talk to me about what it means to be the first Black woman in this role.
So first, I thank you for this opportunity and for this interview. Being the first means absolutely nothing to me. Because at the end of the day, the question is, what do you do with all of the power and the privilege that has been given to you? Being the first is nothing more than a historical footnote. Being the first comes with certain responsibilities to open the doors for others and to stand up against injustice. Being the first means establishing a platform so that others can speak truth to power. Being the first means ensuring that our Constitution applies to everyone and that everyone is guaranteed certain rights and privileges. And all throughout my career as a former public defender, as a legislative aide, as a former city council member, as a former public advocate of the city of New York, the first woman of color elected citywide, and now the first woman of color in New York elected statewide. All that I have done, throughout my career, is stood up and attempted to provide access and rights and equality to all individuals in the state of New York whenever I've confronted it.
What does race and gender equity mean to you? What is your definition of that?
So it means a lot of things. You know, as the first Black woman and as a woman who has seen discrimination, who has tasted racism, I have a duty to address racism, institutional racism, and racism in all of its forms. And equity is really all about leveling the playing field and making sure that individuals who have been deprived have access to all opportunities, not only in the state, but all throughout this country, regardless of their race or their ethnicity or their orientation. It's my responsibility, again, to provide access to all and to truly work on making sure that this is a country which sees me as an African-American woman, but sees beyond my race.
And I want to move forward and actually talk about abortion while we open up this topic. How is abortion playing out in New York State almost 1 year later after that moment, after Roe versus Wade was overturned?
So I am blessed to live in a state where we have made attempts to enshrine reproductive rights in our Constitution. I also happen to live in a state where reproductive rights are protected. And what we are doing here in the Office of the Attorney General is we've established a task force of 40 of the largest law firms in this nation. We have a hotline. The state government, under the leadership of the legislature and the governor of the state of New York, have provided resources to community-based organizations to increase their capacity to provide reproductive access to all individuals, not only those here in New York State, but all across the country. Individuals who reached out on our hotline to ask questions with regards to their criminal liability, their civil liability, and their vulnerability in their respective state, if in fact they were to assist an individual in getting an abortion. My days at representing and protecting reproductive rights go back to when young girls would come into my city council office, young girls who did not know where to turn, young girls who did not come from perfect families, and some who did come from perfect families, who basically sought quite a bit in the borough of Brooklyn. And I will always provide them with assistance. It's important that individuals know that the overturning of Roe versus Wade was a political decision. And this most recent decision in the fifth district was also a political decision. And it was a decision based on the values of one individual who overturned 20 years of precedent against mifepristone, a drug where millions of individuals have taken, and it's been kept and it's been safe. It's been the subject of a lot of scientific evidence and expertise. And for one judge, one male judge, to overturn that decision, really, and to substitute his values and his knowledge over that of scientists and experts and doctors is an affront to me and to all individuals who care about reproductive rights. I am hoping that the United States Supreme Court at some point in time will revisit the Dobbs decision and recognize that they were wrong, that they should have relied upon precedent, and then they should have relied upon the fact that women and others have relied upon reproductive rights in this country, and that their decision was inconsistent with stare decisis.
The overrepresentation of people of color in the prison system. And in New York and throughout America, people of color are far more likely to enter the nation's justice system than the general population. How is your office working to combat the ways the justice system contributes to systemic racism and bias? And how are you measuring that progress?
So as the state attorney general, I'm responsible for all, I represent all the state agencies in the state of New York, and we have jurisdiction over the Department of Correctional Services. And so we have conversations with the governor of the state of New York, as well as with the commissioner, as well as with law enforcement in general, to ensure that their practices are racially neutral, and that the criminal justice system enforces the law based on the facts and on the evidence, and not based on race. It's also instructive that as the Attorney General of the state of New York, which reviews now and has the opportunity to investigate all police encounters with civilian, which may result in their death, we also have an opportunity to review police practices, and if the police officer or the law enforcement officer is responsible for the death of a civilian, to bring charges against that law enforcement officer based on the law, that the ability to prosecute law enforcement officers was removed from district attorneys in the state of New York because of the inherent conflict that exists, because district attorneys have to work with police departments and work with police officers. As the Attorney General of the state of New York, we do not have that conflict. And that's why we have the responsibility, we've been given the responsibility to analyze and to investigate all civilian deaths at the hands of police officers and to bring charges when necessary. And also, we are in a position where we introduce legislation to change our system as it relates to law enforcement in the state of New York, and to ensure that it is racially blind and that we are doing it, again, based on facts and based on evidence. And we have a judicial system which is diverse. And so we continue to work through the political system, as well as with a number of elected officials and the state legislature and the governor to ensure that we have a system which reflects the diversity of the state of New York. And also, let me just say that language access is also a major issue in the state of New York. And one of the things, working with allies on the ground, my colleagues in the Legal Aid Society and a number of allies who are focused on racial justice, they report to me about certain judges in certain counties throughout the state of New York. We have a civil rights bureau. We launch investigations into any allegation of racial bias or racial discrimination or disproportionate number of individuals of color who are being treated unfairly in the criminal justice system anywhere in the state of New York.
And, moving this forward in diversity, because we're not just talking about racial diversity here, we're also talking about gender as well. You recently hosted a drag story hour in New York. And we've seen several Republican-led states actually target drag performances. How do you think about your role as Attorney General in setting the agenda around protecting trans rights?
So I sponsored a drag story hour primarily because two elected officials, two council members who sponsored drag story hours were assaulted. Their offices were vandalized. Their staff was harassed, and their family members. And so as the chief law enforcement officer in the state of New York, it was my responsibility to stand up and to support the trans community and to let everyone know in the state of New York and all throughout the country that hate will not be tolerated in this state. And that this trans hour, to me and to my colleagues, was all about literacy and love. And that's it. And so these allegations that we are hearing and seeing, that we're grooming young children, is nothing, there could be nothing further from the truth. The reality is that the hour-long storytelling that we had with drag queens was, again, about literacy and about love and about toleration of others. And as the Attorney General of the state of New York, I have stood with the trans community and will continue to stand with the trans community because I abhor discrimination, because I understand discrimination, because I have been a victim of discrimination, and because this state will not tolerate discrimination. And that's why we have brought action and defended trans rights in the state of New York and have been a leader all across this nation, joining with like-minded attorney generals and standing up against individuals who will not provide gender-affirming health care to the trans community, standing with individuals who unfortunately have been denied participation in sports, and standing up with the trans community so that they could live their true lives.
And you've been vocal about that, not just in New York, like you said, but outside of New York. You called out Florida Governor last month, Ron DeSantis, for actually violating public university students to privacy over his request on information for those who were receiving gender-affirming care.
Right, because listen, right now what we are witnessing all throughout our nation is politics which are polarizing our nation. And what we are seeing are individuals who are engaging in cultural wars as opposed to dealing with the economic issues that so many Americans are concerned about, and bringing us together as opposed to focusing on dividing us. We find ourselves more divided in this nation than ever before, and it's only because individuals take advantage of certain situations and engage in petty politics and cultural wars at a time when what we really need to be focusing on are, again, economic issues and rebuilding our economy, focusing on manufacturing jobs, and focusing on, again, opioids and fentanyl and other types of drugs that unfortunately are affecting too many communities all throughout this country and in the state of New York. And what we should be doing is responding to them as opposed to, again, fighting one another over artificial constructs such as race and denying women the right to have complete control over their bodies.
And I want to pivot and make sure that we give enough time to also talk about community engagement and trust in the justice system. For many marginalized communities, because of their experiences, the words trust and justice system are polar antonyms, particularly with police accountability and investigations. Tools like video and body cameras, we've seen them proliferate throughout the country, but no significant changes in police violence or outcome or accountability in officers. What is your response to people who say the state of New York has not done enough?
So I would disagree. As you know, I was the council member who advanced body-worn cameras for law enforcement in the city of New York. And as a result of body-worn cameras, we've been able to capture a number of incidents which have drawn attention to law enforcement, resulting in changes in the city of New York with respect to how law enforcement officers police its civilians. And as I mentioned earlier, now as the Attorney General of the state of New York, I have the authority to investigate law enforcement officers when they encounter, the street encounter results in the death of a civilian. I also want to say, as a former Assistant Attorney General, I was involved in the stop and frisk investigation in the state of New York, which led to the demise of that practice in the city of New York. So it's important that individuals know we've made a lot of progress with respect to accountability and transparency. Is it perfect? Do we have a lot more work to do? The answer is absolutely yes, but we certainly have made progress in this space, and we look forward to making additional progress as we go forward.
The Washington Post and other outlets have reported on your investigation of sexual harassment cases in New York state politics. Do you think the country has turned a corner in the past few years in how we handle sexual harassment?
Sure. And obviously, you know, there's been a number of movements, not only in the state of New York, but all across this country, which have brought the issue of sexual harassment to the forefront. And as the Attorney General of the state of New York, I was involved, obviously, in working with the legislature and passing legislation to inform individuals about their rights with respect to sexual harassment and codifying it in law. And as the Attorney General, we not only investigated the former governor of the state of New York, we have engaged in sexual investigations of individuals in restaurants, individuals at their businesses, and we brought justice to countless number of women who have been victims of sexual harassment in the state of New York and in the city of New York, and we will continue to do that.
You said in an article for The Advocate last month, people have an idea of what an attorney general is, and I like to think that I'm not your traditional or typical attorney general. What kind of attorney general would you say you are, and what's your vision for justice reform in New York?
So you don't have a lot of attorney generals who are former public defenders. You don't have a lot of attorney generals who are focused on justice for all. You don't have a lot of attorney generals who have my background. Most of them have come out of corporate law firms, and a lot of them have come from Ivy League law schools and colleges. I graduated from a historically Black university. I am a public defender, and I am someone who is laser focused on justice and justice for all. and who has been focused on the rights of marginalized and vulnerable populations all throughout my career. So I'm not your typical attorney general, but I say that to say that's why change is necessary. And that's why individuals who are viewing this recording need to know that they too need to change the regime of the typical offices, be they Congress, the United States Senate, in the legislature, or in the Attorney General's office, or in the office of the president. We need to make sure that we have a wide range of individuals who apply for different offices and run for different offices and win different offices, and the diversity will go, and the diversity not only at the lower levels, but the diversity will continue all the way to the top.
And we're here, you know, we're having a conversation about race and gender equity, and the people in the room, the people at this summit that are hopefully actively involved here as well. How do you have these conversations with individuals who are not reimagining justice, who stray from uncomfortable conversations when thinking about the words racial equity, gender equity?
So, you know, sometimes you have to make the comfortable uncomfortable. And so it's important that you speak the truth to individuals, not only in settings like this, but wherever you go. It's important that we confront these issues. And it's because there's wounds, and the only way to address the wound is to heal. And it's important that we address these issues. Listen, I just came from Buffalo this past weekend where 10 Black people were murdered who were shopping at a supermarket, at Tops supermarket. And it's important that we recognize and we talk about African Americans, and we be proud of who we are as a people, but we talk about our resilience and our ability to overcome our certain situations. And so, you know, East Buffalo had been ignored for far too long, but now it's getting attention. And because of the structural racism which is baked into that town, which it was redlined, that community is now getting its proper due, but it came late, and it came after a tragedy, and that really should not be the case. And there are East Buffaloes all throughout this country. And what we've got to do is allow individuals to speak truth to power, just as they did in Tennessee, those two young men, just as they're doing in Florida, just as they're doing all across this country. We've got to rise up, resist, and continue to affect change in a wide range of areas. And that is not against anyone. It is all about being inclusive and about equity.
Just to end on a high note, where do you go to stay inspired and committed to this work?
So, as you know, all the movements within the African American community come out of the Black church. So I am a woman of faith. I am inspired by my faith. And every Sunday, my cup is full. And I replenish that sense of urgency and that sense of justice at a house of worship, wherever I can see the word and connect with the word and recognize that now is the time to move this nation forward and to make sure that this nation honors its promises to all of its citizens.
Wow. Amen. Attorney General James, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. It's been informative, engaging, and we touched on so many important issues through the lens of racial and gender equity and justice, and in your position in this fight.
I appreciate it. And as I say, the struggle continues. Thank you. Have a good day. Bless you.
Hello, I'm Erin Haynes, 19th News Editor-at-Large, and I'm so glad to be joined today by Gretchen Carlson, internationally recognized advocate for women's rights. And certainly you may remember her for her bold actions against Fox News chairman, Roger Ailes. Gretchen, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm really glad that you're speaking with us about this topic.
So glad to join your community. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I just want to start by asking you how you're thinking about justice, even in the years since your situation at Fox News, how you're thinking about justice today and what that can look like.
Yeah, so I believe, and my nonprofit Lift Our Voices, we all believe that justice is about owning your own voice. And we believe it starts there. If you don't own your own story and your own truth and your own voice, then how the heck do you ever stand up and speak up about anything else going on in your life that may be unjust? So that is why we are fighting so hard to get rid of these silencing mechanisms that have kept these horrible issues at work in the dark. And the number one question I get, Erin, from survivors when they reach out to me after they've signed an NDA, for example, is, well, I really just want to own my voice again. And then it's too late. So the work I'm doing is to try to make sure that people are not even put in that situation anymore to be silenced. And so for me, justice is the truth, and it's owning your own story and being able to speak it.
So Gretchen, do you feel that even as people are raising their voices, that those voices are being heard and that more people are getting justice? What do you think about in terms of kind of what justice looks like after folks have raised their voices in some of the ways that you're talking about?
Yes, I believe that we have come so far in the last 6.5 years since my story, and then 5 years since Me Too. I mean, first of all, women are being believed. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but we weren't before. And there are consequences now. And I think that the general public realizes, as well as lawmakers, that this movement is not going away. So as I always say to companies or to lawmakers, get on board the train because it left the station. And then as an organization, we are trying to make sure that we work hard to eradicate these silencing mechanisms so that people can actually get justice. So the two things that we see as the evils that keep these issues secret are forced arbitration clauses in your contract at work, or even just in your handbook, or even if you click on an email, and non-disclosure agreements. And last year, we were successful in passing 2 federal laws that get rid of those so people can seek justice in the court of law, which is their 7th Amendment right. And we were so successful in getting those bills passed into law, which are the biggest labor law changes in the last 100 years.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up. Talking about even your situation and the impact of NDAs on you, an interesting thing that I just learned talking to you that I hope you will share with our audience. I certainly saw the movie Bombshell, and I know a lot of other people have. That was your story, and yet you were not even allowed to participate in the telling of that story. Can you talk about that?
Yes, well, I'd love to be able to tell you my impressions of the movie as well as the miniseries, The Loudest Voice, that was on Showtime, but I'm not allowed to. So not only could I not participate in any of these projects about my life and my truth and my story, but I can't even comment on whether or not I think the portrayals are accurate or not, or whether or not the storyline is accurate. And so, you know, look, I have often said that these movies and the miniseries, they did a great service to our nation because, first of all, the actresses took on these roles, Nicole Kidman and Naomi Watts. I mean, they were high caliber people who said, yes, a movie about sexual harassment, would have never done that 6 years ago. And the American public learned so much from it. And even if it helped just one woman or man to know that they could come forward and it would be okay, then they are successful projects. So even though I've demanded Fox to let me out of my NDA, which I had to sign upon resolution with them, they have never responded to me. And the other way they get you, Erin, is that my NDA is with 3 parties. My NDA is with the parent company of Fox, then with Fox News, and then with Roger Ailes' family, even though he's dead. It supersedes to his wife and his son, who's only 24 years old. So he's probably going to outlive me. And I probably will never, even if one party said, we'll let you out, maybe the other 2 don't. So, you know, this is how we've kept these issues silent. And the number one thing I heard from so many survivors after my story was, thank you for being the voice for the voiceless, because the exact same thing happened to me. I was shoved into arbitration, never to be heard from ever again. And by the way, they never work again either. Or on top of arbitration, I also signed an NDA. So it's like a double whammy. I can never tell even certain family members about my life, not to mention the mental health aspects of not owning your own story.
Yeah, what you're saying is really so important. And I just have to say that this is raising for me just the question of, you know, whether it's part of justice for you, really just being able to get justice for other people, the thing that you cannot even get for yourself, helping people to really have the voice that you don't get to have because of your situation and because of that NDA.
I thought you were going to say is, you know, getting out of my NDA, my own justice, but you nailed it, because I often say, well, first of all, this will be my legacy. I was a journalist for 30 years, and no interview I've ever done, including world leaders and presidents, will even come close to the work that I'm doing now. And this is not about Gretchen Carlson. This is about the millions of people that I'm helping that I will never, ever meet, likely. And so what you said, Erin, is so true. I am seeking justice for the people that maybe don't have the same platform or the same resources to be able to fight for it. And I wake up every morning and know what's ahead for me, because I will not stop until I get this done for every protected class. No one should face discrimination or harassment or assault at work and be silenced as a result of it. And people around me, and even people on the Hill, they know I'm relentless. So when they see me coming, they know I'm coming for another vote.
Okay, so you mentioned the legislation that you got passed, the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault Act, which we've written about, and the Speak Out Act. Both of those were passed with bipartisan support in Congress last year. Can you just talk about each of those pieces of legislation and the challenges, frankly, that you may have faced in trying to get that legislation passed, and what the impact already has been, if you can talk about that?
Yes, so getting the arbitration bill passed was a 5-year slog. Passing legislation is almost impossible. And when you factor in that we live in the most hyper-political time of our generation, the idea that we could bring two parties together who, for the most part, don't agree on anything on these issues and find common ground was miraculous. And so a 5-year journey of me trying to pretty much convince Republicans to come on board with this, because getting rid of these silencing mechanisms is a much more democratic issue. And I knew I needed 10 Republican senators in the Senate to be able to get past the filibuster. And so, you know, we started strategizing about who to go to. So we went to people who were retiring because we thought they might be bold. We went to trial lawyers because oftentimes they've seen the injustices in the system already, and that proved to be true. That's how we got somebody like Senator Josh Hawley on board, who you would never think would have supported this, but he was a trial lawyer, so he had seen the injustices. And of course, we went to women, and that's how we got Murkowski and Collins and Shelley Moore Capito. And every time that we got another Republican, my kids were actually involved with me on this. We would like do a dance, happy dance in the kitchen and write their name up on the refrigerator. So this was a long process of getting to the point where we knew we could get it passed. And Erin, I think what happened was that over that 5 years, there was really a tonal shift amongst members of Congress who had voted against it the first go around in 2017, but realized what I was saying earlier, that this movement is not going away. And I would say to them, raise your hand if you think it's okay to continue silencing women and men in the workplace who are assaulted or harassed. And then I would see no hands, and I would say, all right, now we're going to have a discussion about this. The other big point is that these issues are apolitical. When somebody decides to assault you or harass you, they don't ask you what party you're in because they don't care. This is all about power. And so that was, you know, a huge message. And it was so interesting because members of Congress would almost immediately start telling me stories that their wives had told them or their daughters had told them. And they were proving my point. So getting to that moment where we finally passed it unanimously in the Senate and then in the House, and being with the president and vice president last March 3rd with my family with me and so many survivors and the bipartisan coalition, and being able to sign that into law was one of the biggest events in my life. And I knew it was going to help so many other people. And then the strategy paid off because we were immediately able to introduce the Speak Out Act, which takes away NDAs for sexual misconduct. And that went through the system and passed in a matter of 8 months. So we got 2 of those laws passed in the same year, but we are far from over. We're going back for more.
So you actually walked right into my next question, which is, what is next on the horizon for you legislatively? You had those 2 huge legislative wins last year, but I get it, right? You say that you're not done.
Yes, so at my nonprofit, Lift Our Voices, our mission is to eradicate these silencing mechanisms for all toxic workplace issues. So all forms of discrimination, whether it's race, gender, age, disability, LGBTQ+, you name it. We want to eradicate silencing all of those groups, because it's like a 2-tiered system now that we were able to pass the sexual misconduct one. People who experience that won't be silenced anymore. But if you're the CEO of a company, do you think it's okay to continue silencing somebody who's discriminated for gender, for example? And so we are already tackling amending the arbitration law coming up in the next couple of weeks to add another protected class. And our goal was this from the beginning, was to bite out of the apple, get a bite out and get this accomplished, and then go back and get more. And we're already working on that. And then we're very active at the state level where you can be more progressive. So in New Jersey, California, and Washington State, you can't use NDAs anymore for these kinds of issues at work, only for trade secrets, which is how it should be. And we just introduced that same legislation in New York State, and it is going for a vote, we hope, before the end of the session in New York in June. So we've seen huge ramifications of even state laws passing because companies that are based in those states then have a real problem in front of them. Are they going to force people into silence in states that haven't passed these laws? Or are they going to just get rid of NDAs overall? And we've seen the domino effect. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Google, they decided globally to get rid of NDAs now because they knew that there potentially would be an uprising of employees and saying this is not fair. And we're kind of hoping that that happens, actually. We're also going to be putting together a corporate grading system this year, which is huge. We'll be the first group ever that will be able to tell you what companies silence you. And it will be a huge benefit for employees. And it's also a subtle push to companies to get on board and take away these silencing mechanisms.
Okay, well, definitely keep us posted on that. As always, at the 19th, we are going to be paying attention to see how that legislation progresses, that policy really around these issues. But I think, as we're closing our conversation, Gretchen, just a couple of more things I want to ask you about. One, I think I would like for you to talk about for people who are seeking justice and trying to take that first step to really finding their voice. What advice is there that you have for them if that is currently where they find themselves, where you once found yourself?
Yes, and I always start by saying it's such a personal decision. With all of the people that I try to counsel or at least correspond with via email, they say to me, should I come forward? And I don't want to be the one that says yes because of this. You will still face potential penalties for having that voice. Now, I'm trying to change the culture too, but I'm going to say a big statement right now. Passing 2 bipartisan laws last year was easier than changing culture and the way that we handle these issues. And so laws help to start moving the needle, but we start forming opinions about all these things early on, and then we bring them with us to the workplace. And so I implore CEOs to set the tone from the top. Imagine if every CEO said, I'm not tolerating any of this where we work, and we're not going to silence you. And when you come forward to tell us that there's a bad actor, we will get rid of them, not you. That starts to change culture. That's not the way that it's currently working right now. And these silencing mechanisms help them get away with it. So, my advice to them is such a personal choice. But in my book, Be Fierce, which was really a guidebook for this, I would tell you that chapter 4 is my 12 points of what you need to do. The top 3 are you have to consult with a lawyer briefly to find out if you actually have a case. Do you have statute of limitations problems, et cetera? Number 2, you have to document, because we still live in a he said, she said environment. And number 3, you have to tell some people, because you have to have witnesses who can vouch for you. We're seeing that in cases all the time now, right? Somebody has an event happen and then they can go back and show that they sent an email to somebody saying what happened. It's really, really crucial. And bring that information home from your work, because I've heard from so many women who did document and then they were fired when they came forward and they couldn't go back to their office. So these are just a couple of the points, but, and the last thing I would say is go to the press. Go to the 19th, because if there were ever a time when the press cared about publishing these stories, it's still now. And that is such an integral part of this in helping us all find our own voice and justice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. And I mean, look, you brought up workplace culture. So I do kind of want to close out by asking you about this current intersection of journalism, gender, and these workplace-based sexual issues. Your former employer, Fox News, recently fired Tucker Carlson, and the allegation is that there maybe were some sexual issues at play and that there's a lawsuit that's pending. There's a whistleblower there in that situation. So I just kind of wonder what you make of that current intersection and what you think that it says really in terms of justice and accountability in this space.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I've been very vocal about this because in a nutshell, there's a big, huge difference between conservative or liberal opinions on TV and outright lies. And that's what Fox was doing in the election cycle and continued to do, and lied to the American public, which I feel is a complete disservice and a threat to democracy. With regard to, oh, and let me just add that as I said in my op-ed in the Daily Beast, if you do not do a full-scale change and get rid of all the people who promulgated those lies, then there won't be meaningful change at Fox News, because they can just put anyone else they want to in those time slots. And if they also start talking about the lies, then what change really happened? With regard to the whistleblower, Abby Grossberg, she and I have been in contact. She's sort of the next iteration of what I started. And I think she has much more information and ability to know how to get it done. But she is the brave woman who's now taking on this fight. And I think it's very interesting that it always pretty much comes down to women who are willing to stand up, speak up, and be brave. And I really actually believe that it's her accusations about the misogyny and the sexism that was happening, that she claims was happening to her at Fox. I actually believe that that has more to do with the firing of Tucker Carlson than the Dominion lawsuit, because Fox has claimed that they have cleaned up everything about their toxic workplace culture. And maybe that's not true based on her lawsuit. And it could be that that actually supersedes the lies they were saying about Dominion. So in my mind, I feel like her lawsuit was a crucial part of why Tucker Carlson was fired, because you have to ask yourself, why were none of the other liars fired yet, right? So that's why I feel like her coming forward had a massive impact on shining a light on allegedly what the environment was there.
Well, thank you for your thoughts on that. And Gretchen, thank you just very much for really talking to us about using your voice and what that means in this overall conversation that we're having about justice today.
Thank you. Liftourvoices.org. If people want to jump on the bandwagon with us, we'd love to have them. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Candace Norwood, and I'm a reporter with the 19th who covers many of our criminal legal issues. Today, I'm joined by Insha Rahman. She is the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at the Vera Institute of Justice, a national research and policy organization. I also have with me Gina Clayton-Johnson, founder and executive director of the SC Justice Group, an organization that works with women who have incarcerated loved ones. Thank you both for joining me today to talk about the effects of mass incarceration and how we can think about approaching justice more equitably. I feel like a good place to start is incarceration during the pandemic, because we know that COVID-19 led to some releases of people in jails and prisons, but those who were left behind experienced a lot of devastation as a result of the pandemic. So I want to ask both of you, do you feel like there are any lessons to be learned from the COVID era responses that you have observed over the last 3 years? And we can start with Insha.
Well, you mentioned COVID behind bars, and COVID was devastating for all of us. There's a statistic that just came out. I'm in New York City, which is of New Yorkers, 1 in 4 of us had somebody we know or love die during the pandemic. Like, that's an astonishing number. And what we know about COVID in jails and prisons was we thought it was bad in the community. It was 6 to 10 times worse behind bars. I mean, people were sick and died at rates that we don't even know, because we don't pay enough attention to what happens behind bars and what people experience. There's no medical care. There's no ability to isolate and to create space, and all of the measures that we know actually protected us to some degree during COVID. So the big lesson, I think, is, first of all, like, we know that jails and prisons are across the board unsafe places. We see that in the rates of violence and harm and neglect that happen. And then when a pandemic is layered on top of that, they are deadly. And nobody should be facing a death sentence just because they are incarcerated. And yet that's what we saw during COVID. And so I hope the big lesson is that we actually stop and reckon with the lack of real efforts that were made to release people during COVID. Yes, there was some, Candace, as you noted, but it wasn't nearly enough to respond to the level of crisis that COVID caused behind bars. And what we do know, though, is there's a recent study that just came out that found, of the places that did release some people from jails and prisons, in fact, it was good for public safety, good for public health. It was the right thing to do. And I hope that we take that lesson, we have some humility and reflection that we didn't do enough, and use that to take a different path moving forward, pandemic or no pandemic.
Well, I think what I have to add to that is just how much the effect of the pandemic is still very much impacting the realities for people who are behind bars as well as their families. Everything that Insha said in terms of the way that the pandemic came crashing down into places of incarceration is absolutely real. And one of the things that I worry about now is that as things are opening up for people who are not incarcerated, that many of the jail systems and the prison systems that we are connected to are still using the pandemic as an excuse to keep families apart. And so what that looks like is that if I want to go, actually just last weekend, I went to go visit my cousin in Twin Towers here in Los Angeles, which is a jail here in LA. And I had to drive to, this jail, sign up online in advance for an appointment, only to sit in the same building that he is in, downstairs, on a disgusting phone, staring into a screen where I could look at him on a video monitor while he was just a few floors up, right? And they would not allow me to see him. They blame it on an elevator that's been broken for 8 months. But what we're constantly hearing is, oh, well, we're not going to resume visits or in-person visits because we have a fear of COVID, or, COVID protocols say that we can't do visitation and so forth. But what we know is that there's actually, very little basis for what those policies are that are based in medical or safety reasons. They're in fact creating more isolation and more disconnectedness. And so that's actually what we're really concerned about in the right now, is the ways in which these kind of pandemic policies will be used to continually kind of crack down on family connectedness in ways that are really harmful for the outcomes of people who are incarcerated, and also the stability of the families who are on the outside. So we're seeing a lot of that right when the pandemic struck. Our women with incarcerated loved ones assembled in number to find out, how can we understand what is going on inside, because no information was coming out. And so we surveyed a number of people and produced, some of that in the Lives on the Line report, but also did a great amount of work just trying to get PPE inside, like soap and other kinds of just hygiene products are products that right now many prisons and facilities do not provide, and is actually oftentimes paid for by family members, by women who are buying these so that folks can stay safe inside. And so both the burden of maintaining health and hygiene and safety is taken on an economic way, and also in a worrying way by women. on the outside, but it's also very much a reason why women are continually being isolated from their family members inside. And so it is a bizarre and horrific set of circumstances that we're now needing to navigate and organize around.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Insha, in terms of thinking about how individuals end up behind bars, I mean, we know that there are a number of structural inequities at play here. And Insha, I know you were a public defender before moving to the Vera Institute, which gives you a lot of insight into some of those inequities. In recent years, women have been the fastest growing incarcerated population in the US, and LGBTQ plus individuals are disproportionately incarcerated at a higher rate than the general population. So Insha, can you talk about what are some of the structural factors for both of these groups that are contributing to their incarceration levels?
Well, I want to take a step back and just give some context about this system as we know it, right? There are about 2 million people behind bars today in jails and prisons, and you're right that women are the fastest growing segment of that population. And every year in this country, there are 240 million calls to 911. So that's 240 million times that somebody is calling because there is something happening, a crisis. And in less than 20% of those calls, is there anything that actually looks like a crime to most of us? When people are calling for crisis and for help, it is often for other needs that are unmet by our government, by our institutions. And so we have one default, which is the police and 911. And what we know is there's 10 million arrests that happen a year. And again, of those 10 million arrests, less than 5% are for crimes of violence. And so I think that's a really important place to start, because what it suggests is that the way that people come into the system, including women, is by what we choose to criminalize and what we choose to have a police and arrest response and a responsive prosecution. And then the second piece is when somebody is in the system, what do we choose to do? And right now, the sort of standard default on offer is a cash bail system that disproportionately harms people of color and poor people, and a lack of other creative solutions that actually drive safety, like alternatives to incarceration, like programs in the community, like supportive services that actually address the underlying reasons why somebody got arrested in the first place. So I think that context is really important to understand, like what we choose to criminalize and how we choose to respond to somebody who's in the system. So with that, why are we seeing particular groups of folks especially sort of coming through the system and making up disproportionate numbers? For one thing, it's, again, because of what we choose to criminalize. What we see with women in the system is that they are often being criminalized for behavior that many of us would consider like, can't we have a different response? Like substance use and untreated mental health needs, trauma, from sexual abuse to all other kinds of abuse. People forget that instability in and of itself, like not having basic needs met around housing and shelter and care and family supports, is often a driver of why people are in the system. So again, if we want a response that actually prioritizes safety and people's well-being, we wouldn't be arresting and prosecuting women. We would actually address the underlying needs with services, supports, care, housing, treatment. So that's really why we see what we see, and that's especially true for folks who are LGBTQ or gender nonconforming. What I've seen in my days as a public defender, and as a public defender up in the Bronx, New York, so one of the poorest congressional districts in this country. And what we saw is communities that were over-policed and underserved in terms of like actually having real investments in the resources and services that make communities safe. But you would see a police car on every corner. And I would be in arraignments, which is this 8-hour shift where whoever has gotten arrested in the previous 24 hours would come in, and it would be case after case after case of somebody jumping a turnstile, which means they didn't have a couple of dollars in their pocket to actually pay the fare for the subway, or being arrested for possession of a little bit of marijuana or a little bit of drugs. And again, I would say that's a public health issue, not one of crime or criminalization, or other sort of disputes like an argument with a neighbor or with a kid, where the right response is to think about restorative justice, counseling, some intervention, not the system, because it's got really nothing on offer. And what we know from that is people who go through the system and people who spend even just a day in jail or prison are more likely to be in the system in the future when they're released, because of the fact of incarceration is so destabilizing. You lose your housing, your job, your relationships with your families, your kids, all of the things that keep you stable and safe. All of those are gone literally within hours because of the fact of an arrest and stepping into a jail cell or a prison cell. So we can do this differently, but it's a set of choices that we've made to have the system that we have. None of us think it really works, and we can make choices to do it differently.
Thank you for that. To turn to you, Gina, I feel like the subject of criminal justice reform has this cycle of being really prominent in terms of public attention and even lawmaker attention, and then kind of fading from mainstream conversations. So I want to get your thoughts on where you feel we are in terms of momentum of public and political support to reduce mass incarceration.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that we've seen a lot of very exciting momentum, as you put it, over the last several years. Certainly in the last since 2014, since Ferguson, we saw an increase in kind of mainstream progressive media attention and discourse, public officials, as well as movement energy directed at policing in particular as one subset and one major part of our kind of punitive infrastructure that includes mass incarceration as we know it and describe it. I think, that kind of crescendoed into a moment in 2020 where we saw the largest uprising in history, with over 600 cities across the country rise up and really make demands that were rooted in communities' understandings of the systemic nature of these issues, right? That like, just because we see a person who has been harmful as a part of a police department, we're not just simply asking for that, killer office, that officer's killing our folks to be fired and prosecuted. We're seeing demands that actually say, well, wait a second, this person exists as part of a culture and as part of a system that is doing tremendous amounts of harm. This is a tip of an iceberg, right? It's a symptom of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed. And so with the calls to re-examine our budgets, and really the ways in which we approach all the things that Insha was talking about, right? How do we look at our mental health realities, our domestic violence? How do we look at and understand needs around addiction and housing, and how do we treat people with otherized identities and so forth, that don't just look like a cage at every turn, became very much more of the kind of public conversation, which was exciting. I think right now we're in a moment where there is a feeling of kind of compounding crises, right? We saw a withdrawal of many kind of protections that folks in the women's rights spaces have long kind of worked hard to try and preserve. We've seen the impacts of a far right rhetoric and movement taking hold in different ways that look like, really desperate attempts to cling to white supremacist power and patriarchal power in a variety of ways. We've seen infringements on our democratic systems that look like, threats to voting rights and access. And so I think there's a feeling right now, not to mention kind of the climate, realities that I think people feel very deeply. And so I think that there's a reality where where folks are trying to make sense of the numbers and the amounts and the accumulation of crises, that are kind of constantly being discussed in the public space and sphere, and also the kind of coming out of that phase of a pandemic that we're still in, where the immediate needs of people are are larger than they have been in prior time. I've been organizing for years, and I've never seen the level of need among women as great as now. I just finished facilitating a cohort of women who we were focusing on reentry, women with incarcerated loved ones. And every week we met for 9 weeks. Do you know that during that 9-week period, I had a cohort member who experienced housing loss, losing her own housing and that of hers and her 5-year-old that she takes care of twice in 9 weeks, right? And this is not uncommon in LA County and across the country, in fact, that the level of instability that people are facing and the amount of immediate needs has risen. And so I think right now there is that feeling of crisis. There is that feeling of where are we after, so much momentum and so much debate and discussion. And I think that where we are now is in an exciting place where we've opened up conversation and we've seen wins. And we have a real opportunity to assemble community around those very, very urgent needs, but being able to connect dots between what is it that folks are going through and what are the policies and what's kind of the systemic landscape that we must come together as a community and address. And that's why, and I'll end there, which is what I think is really important. That's why base building and creating communities, politicized communities of women in this moment is critical. It will deliver the gender justice wins and the race justice wins that will usher in the kind of human rights reality that we all want and deserve. And I think that the last 10 years and even prior have really readied us for this moment. And so I'm feeling optimistic, despite all of the crises and all of the things that I feel very connected to as well. I actually feel optimistic about what is possible.
I'm so with you, Gina, that I actually think we are winning, and there is a ton of hope and opportunity and optimism moving forward. And I know, Candace, I think some of what you were getting at was we've seen crime rates increase in some parts of the country. We have definitely seen since 2020 much more media coverage, and I would say politicians on the campaign trail fear-mongering around issues of crime and safety much more than I saw 5 years ago. And what I do think is really remarkable about this moment and the sort of forward momentum that we have is we saw during the midterm election season last year, the Republicans spent $157 million across the country on ads, basically calling Democrats soft on crime and fear-mongering that if you vote for this Democrat, there will be blood on the streets. And I'm not really turning this into a partisan thing of Democrats and Republicans, but we know this, that the Willie Horton sort of tough on crime rhetoric has historically been incredibly potent and powerful and effective at undermining really necessary and important justice reforms and forward momentum and progress. What we actually saw on November 8th at the ballot box was by and large voters rejected that tough on crime, fear-mongering and rhetoric. We didn't see the sort of red crime wave materialize that many pundits had predicted. And we actually did some really interesting public opinion research coming out of the midterm elections to understand what did voters take to the ballot box around crime and safety and justice. And speaking of women, it's actually women, Black women, who have said more so than any other constituency in this country that I am concerned about crime and safety. And I'm not just concerned about crime and safety over there in that big city, which is what we often hear from white voters, which frankly is a dog whistle. What we know from Black women voters is I'm concerned about crime in my own community, in my own neighborhood, for my own families. And then by the same measure, oftentimes what's assumed, the conventional wisdom is if you're concerned about crime, we need to double down on more tough on crime policies. But it turns out those same voters who say, I am concerned about crime, say, If I were to be given a choice of investing in preventing crime before it happens versus more tough on crime policies, I will pick that prevention approach that invests in treatment and services and meeting people's basic needs instead of just reacting in the aftermath, which is what our typical tough on crime status quo approach takes. So I think there's a really important lesson to be learned, and I want to say it in every single place, which is when we're concerned about crime and safety, as we know Americans in this country are today, there's actually an approach that folks favor, which is what Gina and I are talking about, what our organizations are working for, what our movement is working for. And it actually, I think, is winning, and there's momentum, and the tough on crime status quo is, I think, actually starting to lose, and that's really, really powerful for us.
Thank you both for that. And I want to turn the discussion to bail and the bail system, because I know that's something that you both know about. That seems to be another area in terms of reform conversations that has received a lot of attention. And I'd like to ask both of you, can you talk about why the subject of money bail and concern about pre-trial detention more broadly, why that's important to highlight in this discussion about equitable justice and also gender justice? And we can go back to Gina.
Well, I think what I want to do is I want to tell you about what's going on right now, which is that I just walked into the office and walked past a colleague who was on her way right now to a jail with $62,000 in a check. It's a lot of money. To go bail out a Black mom here in LA County. A couple of days earlier, another group of women with incarcerated loved ones met outside of Santa Rita jail in Alameda County to bail out another Black mom with a $20,000 check. Now, to be clear, that money comes back, right, to be used to bail out other moms in other actions, because the way that it works right now is that if you're arrested, in most places, there will be an amount of money that a judge sets or a bail schedule sets that says, if you want to go back to your family and fight your case on the outside because you are legally innocent, right? You've just been accused of something. We still have a whole process that determines whether or not you're guilty or innocent. Then you have to pay this amount of money. And that amount of money is supposed to ensure that you come back to court. Basically, we have your money, we'll give it back to you if you, see through the rest of the court dates and come back to court. Now, what we know, because we have, great organizations like, INCHA's working to bring us real stats and be data driven, is that people aren't coming back to court, aren't not coming or coming back to court because of that money. It actually is a very ineffective way to ensure people come back to court. People come back because they, are getting reminders and in the right ways, or have transportation access, or have some basic needs met. And oftentimes people do come back to court, but more often than not. And so there is kind of this mythology about people, leaving and running off to, some country or something when they're facing charges. That's not actually what is happening. But what is happening is that low income folks, and particularly Black people, brown people, low income folks, are being caged pre-trial. So for example, the woman that we bailed out earlier, a couple days ago, she was in for 2 months after being arrested because she was sleeping in a car. She was in for 2 months. She hadn't been convicted of anything. She was waiting for her court date inside of a cage, away from any kind of ability for her to, get healthcare, to get treatment, to be with children. Completely cut off from anything. Right now, that is our approach to homelessness, to mental health, disability, all kinds of issues that we know how to address. But right now our approach is with a cell. And so what we do at SE and as part of a larger group of organizations is that we make some noise about the fact that our bail system is deeply unjust and not working. Every single year before Mother's Day, we raise money and we bail Black women out of jail. And then what happens, and what oftentimes happens, is that the focus is on the person who gets bailed out. But what I like to remind folks is that the way that we all get free is through base building. And what the beautiful thing of this work of bailouts is that we actually bring together women who themselves have been incarcerated at another period in their life, women who have themselves loved someone behind bars, who bring expertise around how to successfully usher someone home from a period of incarceration back into reintegrating successfully into community and family, who understand the kinds of needs that someone has, and can address those needs. We bring that community together in order to support the reentry of that individual. That is what our systems should look like, right? Chandrika last year, she's somebody who we bailed out, and I hope that the woman we bailed out a couple of days ago follows her same path, because when she came home, we had a welcome home party in a park, and all of our SE community came together, and in that community, she found someone who she asked, would you be my sponsor? A year later, she had, clocked a year of being clean and sober, had been, her case had been resolved favorably. And she had graduated from our Healing to Advocacy program. She said, for the first time in my life, I feel like I have family. And that is what people need, right? Not this system that says you can only have freedom if you can, pay $20,000 and then, and enrich a bail industry and agent. It makes no sense. And it's something that we already know what the alternative should look like. We just need to build the people power and the awareness to bring it into fruition.
I think Gina's describing the incredible sort of transformational opportunity of the bailouts. And it's amazing at a very sort of like person to person organizing base building level. What she's too humble to say is just how much these bailouts, which y'all have been doing, Gina, I'd say, 5, 6 years now?
7, this is our 7th
year.
Yeah.
That's incredible. But the amount of attention it actually brings to the bail system and the injustice of having money and not safety actually determine who stays in jail and who's released. Like, I really think these bailouts, and they've been happening year after year, have helped the everyday average person in this country be like, wait, why do we have a money bail system? Why is somebody arrested and behind bars for 2 months simply for sleeping in a car and all these other sort of ridiculous circumstances that I just think highlight the injustice and make people feel the urgency of we need to do this differently. And oftentimes people ask, well, if you eliminate cash bail, then what? And we actually have really good answers to then what. That money shouldn't determine this really, really important critical decision, that in fact public safety can. And when we let safety determine these decisions, we have very, very different outcomes. And so the state of New Jersey eliminated bail in 2017, over 6 years in. They've dropped their jail population by almost 50%. You know what? Crime hasn't been impacted at all. People are safe. They are home with their families and their jobs. They're coming back to court. The system works. The sky doesn't fall down. Many of us have heard about bail reform in New York, and at least from like the public headlines, it looks like it's been a disaster, right? That's what most people would say. And while it's been difficult in the public relations front, when you actually look at the data and what's happening, again, far fewer people behind bars. People are coming back to court. In fact, crime rates have not been impacted at all, despite what the headlines tell you. Look beyond them, because those are scare tactics. They're not real solutions. And if you look at the real numbers, bail reform is working in New York as well. So here's the big lesson learned, because I mentioned the sort of, and I hate to use the word backlash because it sounds sort of like it just happened. I would say the very organized misinformation and disinformation campaign around these reforms, that they are in fact bad for public safety, that you can have safety or you can have justice, but you can't have both. That is false. It's a falsehood. And so what we've learned from places like Illinois and New Jersey and New York is you can in fact take money out of the equation, and we are better off for it. We're safer and we're more just. So I really hope that that's the lesson that people are learning around bail reform sort of writ large, in addition to how powerful individual actions and organizing around the issue is.
Insha and I, we can talk about bail
all day,
for on and on forever. But what I think it's really important for, this audience to understand how much of a women's rights issue this is. A few years ago, when we started doing our legislative work around bail reform, there was a press conference where we had a Black woman of our base set up to speak. And she was really excited about it and was going to talk about her brother's incarceration at that event. And the kind of organizers of the press conference were like, looked at the list of names, which were a lot of men, and pointed to her and said, you know, after reading kind of what she was going to say, why is she speaking? That's what their question was. She has not been incarcerated. She is, you know, a woman with an incarcerated loved one. Why is she speaking? You know, we kind of tried to explain. But it wasn't until after she gave her testimony that I think I saw it all of a sudden click for like the entire room. She took the whole room and made it clear what was happening inside of our bail system and why it needed to be addressed. And it was because she was able to speak about the fact that women are the ones who are paying the bail industry, right? When the bail bondsmen like go to create advertisements, they target grandmothers, mothers, women with incarcerated loved ones, because they know that when that the people who are getting those phone calls out from jail saying, I need help, it's women on the other side of that who are carrying the emotional load, the financial load, the opportunity cost realities. All of that impact is borne on women, right? And that's true for if you're, incarcerated and you're a woman, if you're incarcerated and you're a man of any gender, right? That women are the ones who are in these positions, caretaking and doing that work. What's true is that when someone is incarcerated from your family, 64%, there's a 64% decrease in household assets, right? Just from having a loved one behind bars. That is because of systems like our bail system. And so if we care about the destabilization of women and the outcomes of women and gender justice work more broadly, we need to really be looking at the ways in which our bail system is a poverty pathway and a poverty trap for so many women who are impacted by it. And so I like to explain that because I think oftentimes, our vision is very narrowly focused, and understandably because of how the public narrative is kind of focused often on men's experiences inside of our systems. But what's true is that women we're seeing a lot of harm, but also a lot of expertise, right? As born out of that impact that we can uplift and generate solutions as well as people power to bring about some change.
If someone is coming into this subject wanting to learn more, but through their own experiences may have preconceived notions about mass incarceration, why people are incarcerated, et cetera, can you both offer one thing? I know it might be hard. One thing that you've hope someone can learn that might be a misconception about how these systems work. Insha, we could start.
Well, so the suggestion I have, the only thing it takes is a little bit of time. So courtrooms are public spaces, although you wouldn't know that unless you yourself have been arrested or you have somebody who's been arrested that you love and you've gone down to court. But going and sitting in a courtroom, even for an hour, and seeing like the assembly line of the justice, or I would say injustice system, is profound. And I think it is life-changing and transformative for anybody who sits there to see, like, what does this look like in the day-to-day? So I suggest everybody go down to your local Main Street, your local courthouse, watch a couple of bail hearings. It'll only take a couple to be like, what are we doing and how do we do this differently?
I think the 101 reading for anything related to mass incarceration is Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. That's just where you start, I think, if you're really in a starting place. I think the other thing is just knowing and acquainting yourself and really letting the stat marinate that we have nearly 2 million people who are incarcerated in this country, that we are the world's leader of incarceration, and combine that with an understanding that was a 500% increase over a short 40-year period. What that means is that these are political decisions. It wasn't that like all of a sudden we had this huge eruption of crime in this country. People aren't being incarcerated because there's more crime, incarcerated in a higher rate because there's more crime. There is a different approach that all of a sudden was taken that has been very harmful and very ineffective. And so I think there's actually just situating yourself with the stats and then do some reading in addition to exactly what Insha was saying, connecting to courts and also community organizations that do base building work is a great way to get started.
Well, thank you both so much for being here with me today to help us learn more about these important issues.
Hi, everyone. Melma here, and I'll be guiding you through a meditation simply on presence. Really, all meditation practice is meant to get us back into our bodies and back into the now. The word mindfulness is so popular these days in our world, and really mindfulness just means being full of the present. That's really where your power lies, whether you're at a business meeting, whether you're giving a speech, whether you're just talking to your family and friends. The way you can truly communicate your purpose and your true intentions is to be present. So let's do a little meditation together where we'll connect to the breath and really understand what it feels like to be present. So you can find a seat or you can stand, whatever you prefer. And just ensure that your spine is straight, shoulders relaxed down the back. Then close your eyes when you're ready. And just start here by softening the whole body. I want you to just gently notice all the sounds around you. And just take in all the tiny little sounds that you can observe here in this moment, not being overly critical or judgmental, just simply observing. And what can you hear? Just that simple act can bring us back to the present, to the now. And now we're going to shape our breath a little bit more. We're going to breathe in for 4 and out for 6. Please take a full breath in through your nose and exhale through the nose. Now breathe in here for 4, 2, 3, 4, out for 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in 4, 2, 3, 4, out 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in 4, and out 6. Take one more round of that. In 4, out 6, slowly counting the breath. No rush, but when you're finished, return to a natural, even breath, in and out through your nose. And to charge up with presence here, we'll do a scan of the body from head to toe. Please bring your attention to the very top of your head. And I want you to imagine that a heavy energy begins to pour down the body. Feel it move from the crown into your forehead, down your cheeks, into the neck, shoulders. It trickles down your arms and into the fingers. Feel this heavy energy through your chest, stomach, and down the back. It moves into your hips, thighs, calves, and feet. Allow your entire body to be weighted with this energy, with awareness, with presence. And notice how the mind naturally slows down as we become aware of the body, as we enter the present moment once more. And this is the power of mindfulness, of presence, to be fully in your body, to be fully you. And relish in this place of ease, peace, and presence, this place of authentic power. And please take one more deep breath in. Exhale through the mouth. And when you're ready, open your eyes. I hope this meditation reminded you all that it doesn't take long to find the present moment again. But what presence really does for us is it creates this massive ability to be back in our power, in our purpose, to do things more intentionally, and to show up more as our authentic selves. So I encourage you all, when you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed, make presence the priority. Take just 30 seconds to connect to your breath, close your eyes, and maybe just do that simple scan through your body. I think you'll find that you'll be very surprised by how positive the results are of taking a little time to be present. Thank you all for your attention and time. I hope you have a lovely day.
Hello again. I'm Erin Haynes, editor-at-large for the 19th, and I'm now joined today by somebody that I've been in conversation with many times, but I'm happy to be in conversation with today as we talk about justice. And that's Tarana J. Burke, Chief Vision Officer and founder of Me Too International. Tarana, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Same. Well, I just want to start off by asking you to weigh in on our theme. We've talked a lot about what justice means, especially around the work that you do.
Yeah, obviously I think about justice a lot in my work. And I think that, I think we might have talked about this before, but we talk about healing justice a lot in our work. And people have heard the word, the term social justice. I think we have to expand the way we think about justice in this country, in particular in the United States, because for us, many of us have been socialized to only think about justice in a sort of law and order framework, right? It's in crime and punishment framework. It is, people commit a crime, there has to be punishment, and it goes inside of this legal system that we have that we know is deeply flawed and in many ways unjust. We have so many statistics and data and all kinds of anecdotal data and actual statistics that let us know that the system of so-called justice that we have in this country is actually biased and discriminatory and systemically racist. And so what we count on for this justice doesn't actually deliver. And when it comes to survivors of sexual violence, it is even more flawed, right? The people who we go to for justice actually can be perpetrators of that violence. I was just watching the documentary I Am Evidence. If people haven't seen it, there's a wonderful documentary called I Am Evidence that talks about the rape kit backlog in this country, which is a perfect example, right? These are people, women, largely women, who after experiencing sexual violence get rape kits done because that's what we're taught, right? There's a crime. In order to get punishment, you get this rape kit. And there are cities like Detroit that had like 11,000 rape kits backlogged. Where's the justice in that? And so I think that we have to expand our understanding of what justice could and should look like in this country. When it comes to survivors of sexual violence, justice has to be defined first and foremost by the people who were harmed. If we shifted our thinking to a harm and harm reduction framework, then justice could be more organically come from the people who were harmed. Folks from the right talk about and preach morality all the time, but from a morality standpoint, really, people who are on a basic level, when you harm somebody, there should be accountability, period. But also the person who you harm should be in a position to say how they want that, what they want that accountability to look like.
Tarana, what you're saying is making me think about also kind of what justice can look like and for whom, right? especially when we start to think about those intersections of race, of gender, justice looking different for members of the LGBTQ community around sexual violence, certainly looking different for Black, Latino, Asian American women, the Indigenous community. Talk to me about how we can talk about changing culture in a way that gets justice in a more equitable way as well.
Well, first we have to stop lumping folks together, right? I think it's, you know, we like to say BIPOC and, you know, sort of put everybody in a neat little, but I think that each community, just like we talk about survivors need to define what justice looks like for them, individual communities have individual needs. So that's something that's also necessary for us to talk to these people inside of their communities and talk about what these communities want and need and what justice looks like for their communities, right? We don't have mainstream, nuanced conversations about justice. And, you know, our friend, Latasha Brown, I was with her recently, and she said something that was so poignant and beautiful. And she talked about having a vision for liberation. And that really sat for me, and a vision for justice. I think that is also something that's really important. We're not thinking about what justice should look like. So we're just responding to the injustice. You know what I mean? We're just constantly responding to injustice. We see injustice, we go and respond to it, but we're not envisioning what actual justice could look like. So we also should, in these discussions, not just be fighting and arguing about the injustice. We should be visioning what justice could look like and should look like for all of us. And it's not going to be universal, to be different, but we can put our visions forward, and in the places where they are similar or you know, we have some overlap, we can fight for that together. In the places where they're not, we can uplift each other. But I think that's really important.
I do want to ask, though, about the survivors agenda that you have, just in terms of the whole Me Too movement being about the power of story, right? And for survivors to really say, to your point about harm reduction and being able to articulate their wants and needs for what justice can look like. Talk about what the survivors agenda is and how you think that can help advance the cause of justice for survivors.
So in 2020, around the election, a group of organizations, the Me Too International, the National Women's Law Center, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and Farm Worker Women got together to talk about putting this initiative, Survivors Vote. And what that was about was really harnessing the power of survivors as a voting bloc. And, you know, Monica Ramirez, who is a brilliant, brilliant strategic mind, you know, she was the force behind the original idea for Time's Up. She's been just a brilliant strategic mind around the movement to end sexual violence, was thinking about how do we bring survivors together to think about what our agenda is moving forward. And so I was really, really interested. I've been really, really interested in what it looks like to harness the power of survivors, because people always engage survivors from a place of weakness, right? From a place of pity. And I'm like, you're looking at a group of people who've already overcome the most, you know, the hardest things you can overcome. That in and of itself is powerful. So these are a powerful group of people. So anyway, we all come together and decide that we want to build an agenda that is created by survivors for survivors. And so Survivors Vote morphed into the Survivors Agenda, which was just that. We got survivor-led and survivor-serving organizations from across the country to survey their constituents around 7 or 8 different areas. And we came up with what survivors wanted to see around policy, around culture, around the way this country needs to move forward to support survivorship. And this agenda, it's at you can see it at survivorsagenda.org. And it really is, it's a beautiful document. It's a beautiful piece of a beautiful piece of policy, but also this document that really is a statement to what survivors have to say about ourselves. And it's never been done before. And so, and it was made up of more than 30 or 40 survivor organizations. And so now we've come together to talk about what we're going to do next, how we're going to work together across the field to move this agenda forward. And so it's been amazing to just work. You know, this is not a competition. This has been one of the best moments in my career in movement work, because I have seen people who have just, you know, it's challenging sometimes to work in movement. And this has been a moment where I think people have seen this is an opportunity for us to really just expand the field and get a lot of work done, a lot of work that we've been trying to get done for a long time. And I think people are taking advantage of that, particularly in this moment.
Well, we definitely are going to stay tuned to see exactly how that plays out. Thank you so much, Tarana Burke, for sharing just your vision of justice and the work that you were and are doing and how you're using your platform to get justice for survivors. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia B. Chan, the editor-in-chief at the 19th. I'm now joined by an intersectional and intergenerational group of advocates as part of our 19th Celebrates series, honoring AAPI Heritage Month in May. With us today, we have Kevin Ipopo, a storyteller and community organizer. Kevin's work centers the intersections between their ethnic identity as a Black American and Samoan person and their gender fluidity. Next, we have Kim Tran, an activist and DEI consultant. Kim has helped to build safe space programs for queer and trans youth, has been a publisher for feminists of color, and led a racial healing process in response to a Ku Klux Klan resurgence. Since 2014, she has trained thousands of community members on uprooting anti-Blackness in their families and on non-police alternatives to community safety. Next, we have Manju Kulkarni, the executive director of the AAPI Equity Alliance. Manju is also the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, on NPR and CNN, and she was recognized with the co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most influential individuals in the world. Bringing us up is Satsuki Ina, the co-founder of Suro for Solidarity, working to end detention sites. Satsuki was born in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, a World War II American concentration camp. Ina has produced 2 documentaries about the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans, and she's been featured in the New York Times, Democracy Now!, and the documentary And Then They Came for Us. She is a professor at California State University in Sacramento and a licensed psychotherapist specializing in community trauma. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. So let's set the stage for everyone tuning in on the landscape of your work right now. And then we'll take a look back and talk about the evolution of this work. So Manju, we'll start with you. Being a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, you and your organization have been chronicling perhaps the most recent development in the day-to-day lives of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in America, the rise in anti-Asian sentiment, crimes, and violence in the last few years. Can you give us a snapshot of where things stand today and what you're currently working on?
Sure. Thank you so much, Julia, for the invitation to be with you all today. And it's just such an honor and privilege to join Satsuki, Kim, and Kevin, as well as you, Julia, for today's panel. So yes, at Stop AAPI Hate, we started really in March of 2020 when we began to see the emergence of anti-Asian hate. There was an incident here in Los Angeles involving a middle school child. And it was from that we created the Reporting Center. You know, for the past 3 years now, we've been receiving reports from all over the country, all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And, you know, we're over the 11,000 mark of getting those. They involve verbal harassment, physical assault, racial discrimination in retail, as well as workplace discrimination. And what we found is that the vast majority are hate incidents and not hate crimes. And that's really important because we know that some individuals in the community have been calling for more law enforcement, but really we know with this data that policing is not going to be the primary solution, given that most are not even crimes. And so what we've decided to do is really focus on local, state, and federal policy. We got 2 bills passed in the California legislature last year. They were to really promote safety in public transit, given that a number of incidents happen there, and to also address discrimination in retail, another arena where we're seeing individuals in our community being harassed, being discriminated against. And so now really looking to build a civil rights infrastructure, as well as promote education equity and true community safety solutions. That's where we're at now.
Thank you. Using this as a jumping off point, Kim, how does this dovetail or not with the work you're currently doing and specifically around coalition building, perhaps?
Sure. I think the work of political education is to help folks envision a different political horizon, right? It's not, here are the laws and how do we reform them slightly. It's kind of what we're talking about here, which is how do we actually want our communities to function in a safer way? Who do you want to call when something happens? Is it your neighbor, or is it a police officer with a gun who might bring deadly violence into the situation? For a number of years now, since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, I've been working with Asian Americans on what it means to have conversations that sound like this in an effective way with your families, because all of these things kind of start at home, right? And so coalition building for me has always begun with, what is it that you want to happen in a highly localized way? From who does your mom or your grandparent call when they feel unsafe, to are you passing out alternatives to police flyers in your neighborhood? That's actually where I've always wanted to start, and where it begins and oftentimes where it ends, right? Because the police are actually the last bastion of safety, and if any sort of version of community safety exists. So coalition building for me is always something that is deeply rooted. It begins with a conversation. It ends frequently with just what you do in your household.
That actually raises a question I have around something, that had been articulated in the current tracking of anti-Asian hate and sentiment has been that previous to 2020, previous to perhaps even 2016, these kinds of incidents weren't being reported. And so to your point, Kim, how have you seen this evolution of conversation, of reporting, shape up in a way that is encouraging to see, or not so much, that perhaps is a signal that more work could be done here?
So I think about this in a twofold way. One, we absolutely need to see the landscape of the uptick in anti-Asian violence. Like, I want that to be visible. I want that to be an important part of how we do our work and what motivates people and instigates people into action. The other side of that is it often comes with a strange lens of anti-Blackness, that there's a fixation on particular bodies perpetrating this violence that's actually just entirely inaccurate. Most of the people who do this stuff are not people of color. So it's kind of this double-edged sword that I want us to be really critical about. One, yes, we are having a conversation about anti-Asian violence, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. People feel a lot more comfortable reporting it, and when they report it, that'll be taken seriously, right? So that's great that we're talking about it in a formal way. The second part is the failure of the conversation has been the kind of anti-Black vein that's laced through it. And I really want us to do that, unlearn that. That's been where a lot of my work lives and exists, because it's also just not true. And so it's always walking that both and of reporting.
Definitely. And to thread really the work that you're doing and the work that Stop AAPI Hate is doing is really kind of hopefully getting at a two-pronged approach here, where we do want the data. We want the data that shows us what is happening, how much is it happening, and who's it happening to, and who's perpetrating the incident. We want all of that data. We also recognize that there are barriers to reporting this to the a more formalized, institutionalized ways. So how we build for that, how we talk about that. This is all within the wheelhouse of so much that we're talking here. So over to you, Kevin. I know this touches on so much of the intersectional work that you do, and your recognition of how the plights of AAPI groups are also the plights of other marginalized groups. So I wanted you to take kind of where we're at in the conversation now and build on it with where you are, what you're seeing, and what you're doing.
Thank you for that interconnectivity. I deeply appreciate it, and I appreciate sharing this space with all of you. This is very much an honor. Yeah, I think when we are considering how we move about the work, like our first introduction to social justice spaces is also like always through our protected identities, right? We learn it through our families and through who we are. And I think oftentimes folks can start to organize within a community and fail to recognize how like we are always in a nuanced position, right? I think Kim kind of touched on like being at this in-between place in which you are actively being oppressed and marginalized, but you also are receiving certain privileges, and being able to unlearn that and challenge that can be incredibly difficult. And I think the conversation always has to begin within yourself, right? Even as a gender fluid person, I have to make my first acknowledgement that I'm incredibly male presenting, and that comes with a significant amount of privileges. And even as someone of mixed race, even though I'm Black American, like I phenotypically present as someone, right? And so with those things, as I move through the world, I have to be mindful of how people perceive me and understand that some of those benefits that I'm receiving allow me to have a unique position within the community to advocate for things that folks wouldn't usually listen for. And I think, when we talk about some of the training that Kim has done in helping folks unlearn anti-Blackness, it's actually something that my siblings and I have implemented within our own family, because anti-Blackness is something that exists in every community, right? And as a result of colonization. And I think if we take our first acknowledgement that anti-Blackness is not inherent, right? This is something that was pushed onto our communities, taught to us, and something that was like forcefully made a perspective. But we can accept that that's happening and that we can work on it. So I think just in the spirit of intersectionality and understanding that all of these struggles and oppressions are inherently connected, and that if we're always focusing on how we're gaining liberation for the folks who are at the deepest margins of society, like we're ultimately uplifting all of us.
Thank you, Kevin. Satsuki, over to you. I'd love to hear how you've observed current dynamics and what your response to it is, and perhaps how it could be different from dynamics you observed in the past with your history of advocacy work here.
Thank you. It's great to be with everybody. My advocacy work began unintentionally. In 2018, we were Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated, separated from our fathers during World War II. We're having a pilgrimage. This is 2018, and to Crystal City, Texas. And through work I had been doing and connections I had, realized that 40 miles on the very same road east was a current facility that was housing separate families had been separated at the border, suffering under undetermined detention. People who were innocently seeking asylum were being criminalized. There was so much resonance between what was happening today and what had happened to us earlier that those of us in our 70s, 80s, and 90s, we were children, we were either born in the prison camps or we were children at the time, realized that this was a repetition of our own history, and felt like after we had our pilgrimage that we needed to get on the bus and go 40 miles and protest the action that was happening. So there were, I think, 1,400 children and families being held in the South Texas facility. And we brought with us paper cranes, which is what the tsudu is, for tsudu for solidarity. We wanted the children inside the prison to know that somebody outside cared, that we were advocating for them. So we wanted them to be able to see the colorful cranes. We also asked Japanese American drummers to come to Texas so that the children could hear us. And it was a significant experience. Telemundo showed up, and that's the only TV station that they could view inside of the detention facility. So the ACLU attorneys, who were the only ones allowed inside, passed on the word about what was happening outside. We wanted to give the family hope and let them know that somebody outside cared, because that was one of the most painful things for the Japanese American community during World War II, is that there was no organized protest. Essentially, we felt that America turned their back on us, and while we were disappearing from the classrooms and our jobs and the farms. And so from that, we've continued our work advocating, and our work is to work across communities. We've continued to identify the multiplication of these detention facilities, even under the current administration, and have mobilized other survivors of our World War II experience and their descendants to show up in organized protests, to speak to legislators, to educate people about what is happening today and how it reflects the way in which in the past we've been fractured from working together. So we are reaching out to and working with organizers from Black Lives Matter, Bend the Arc, Detention Watch Network, Brown Beret, so that we have solidarity when we're making our presence known at the different sites, and continuing our work, because we know now that 17 more of these detention sites that are going to hold mostly undocumented children are planned to be built. So our work started out as a small pilgrimage for a bunch of us old people, turned out to be a rallying cry for how we stand together with other communities to stop this inhumane treatment of people seeking asylum.
Thank you for painting such a vivid picture of what it sounds like an outcome that you wanted, but also we're really surprised at the breadth and depth of. And I wanted to draw or perhaps underscore this past that you have signaled to, in which communities were more fractured, or that, in World War II, this is not a comparison by any means, there were no organized protests, and there are ways in which we can facilitate there are ways in which we can facilitate connectivity now, and how that hasn't happened so much in the past. What are things, and this is a question for you all, but I'll stay with Satsuki right now. What are ways in which you feel like you have been able to facilitate this coalition building, this community, in ways that had not occurred in the past? What is different about now?
Well, for us, I would say it is personal communication, reaching out, having contact. I think Zoom really helps because we can reach out across the country. We are very respectful of people who are organizing on the ground and see ourselves as support people for that. So we're always paying attention to honoring the work that people are already doing, and how can we add our history to that event. So we have reached out personally to different communities, building relationships first, gaining trust, really working to counter the fears that people have that they're going to be appropriated, or are overrun by another organization. And so we've built friendships, and that's been really important. And in through that, that's the basis for our coalition building is to have personal contact. And Zoom has certainly helped us to work across the country. And we have found also that we as a community of people from different organizations, different communities, need a healing. And we found that the healing that was really powerful is when we sat together, people of all different colors sitting and sharing their stories with each other and finding the common bond. And so we do healing circles after every direct action and have found that it has had a powerful effect on building our coalitions.
I think if I can share just a little bit about what Satsuki is saying that feels really important to highlight is one, the relationships that exist and the history that exists and the reality of information sharing right now. One of the most effective things that I think can happen is folks understanding that there's a long history of Asian American solidarity and Black American solidarity that exists, right? And so sharing that with folks oftentimes kind of seeds the possibility of coalition, and then building a relationship on top of that can actually create the kind of coalitionary and solidarity connection required to create social change. So pointing people to the reality that Ho Chi Minh and Marcus Garvey had a relationship, and Dr. King and Thich Nhat Hanh had a relationship, and then getting us to Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X, and then getting us to the 80s where Vietnamese fishermen and Black folks are fighting against the Klan, all the way to Asians for Black Lives. That's a really powerful history. And the minute you give people a sense of it's worked in the past, we've done it in the past, becomes a moment, I think, of a really generative moment where they can start envisioning themselves in those roles as well. And that's where relationships can come from. And that actually isn't possible without knowing the history and then sharing the history and then having an era in which we're on Zoom, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. We get that sense of reality and we get to keep building on that foundation, right?
And if I may jump in, I think too, what's really important as we dive into the history is understanding and seeing the through line, which it really involves institutional racism, right? That it is, and something we try to make very clear at Stop AAPI Hate, both to address the anti-Blackness and then also bring about long-term systemic solutions is this is not just about interpersonal relationships other than the organizing, but like the actual attacks, these often come from governmental policies, right? And we see really a place where rhetoric and policies can drive animus against our communities drives rhetoric and policies. And so, in terms of scapegoating specifically, we are now moving away from COVID-19 being sort of the original place of where this hate comes from right now in the last few years to looking at national security issues, economic insecurity, and of course, public health being those drivers. And you see often legislators, candidates weaponizing those issues in order to, for their own political purposes. But then those literally put our communities in harm's way, both in terms of the interpersonal attacks as well as, the policies again that are used systematically against our communities. And let me just say, when we look at the data, we actually are releasing a report tomorrow, a civil rights report and a study we did with the University of Chicago, which found that nearly 50% of our community members have experienced some form of hate or discrimination in the past few years. And 30% have changed their behavior because of the impacts it's had. And yet only 1 in 5 will report it. It was a question you had asked earlier, Julia, which is, will people share it? Will they hold institutions accountable? And one thing that I think we're all talking about is how important it is for all of our communities, because from, before the time of Japanese American incarceration to, the policies of exclusion under the Asiatic Barred Zone Act to actually the model minority myth. These are all of the ways in which there have been the wedges created between our communities and others, and when policies also then have driven some of the hate.
Yeah, I think returning to this point about history and how the acknowledgement of it is really important. There's a guiding mantra in my work that's a Samoan proverb that is Namato Tutu Lau Maine, which means that on the journey to where I am today, I've rested under many trees. And it's this deep acknowledgement that shade is a blessing, where I am is a blessing, and that all of the organizing that I'm able to do with folks in my community is a result of the labor of everyone who has come before us, right? Like when my parents were growing up and when their parents were growing up, they didn't have the room to think beyond survival. And because of all of the work that they did to secure our safety and to secure food for us, we now have the space to pursue our imaginations for liberation, right? Like the idea of what can be and what will be is so much bigger, because I know in a lot of organizing spaces, folks say like we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's incredibly true, because now that we're here, we can see higher than they could. And being able to take that acknowledgement and really rest with it and realize like everything I have is because of someone else. Now feel that like we have this obligation to pay it forward. Yeah, so I'm always trying to remind folks that like, what kind of tree do you want to become? Right now, we are able to see all of these interconnectivities, all of this like space we're sharing right now digitally with these wonderful folks. And like, what can we build from here? What can we plant today so that, 10 generations from now, folks will be able to imagine even higher than what we're sharing here. I think another big misconception is that this sense of interconnectivity is something new, right? There's another proverb in the Pacific that translates to, we're walking backwards into the future, right? So that like everything that we've done in the past, our history, our traditions, that's what will continue to carry us forward. And in all of our histories, pre-colonization, we had interconnected systems of communication. We had systems of trade and systems of commerce and travel that spanned across the Pacific, across Africa, across Asia, across all these places. And we're constantly being pushed with the narrative that like discovery and connection has come with development as a result of colonization and the Industrial Revolution, right? But like we know that in our own histories, it's already been there. And so as we have this like opportunity to rest and settle into some of the privileges we've gained because of our ancestors and folks who have come before us, we now realize like we've always known these things. We're just able to build into it in a different way and redefine what that connection means for us.
Thank you, Kevin. As the 19th, as a journalism organization, it is our job to chronicle this history, to do our best to lend context and nuance so that we can not only document, the work, but also reveal the connects and disconnects with policy and policy's impact on communities or lack thereof. And so just to tie this all together, at the 19th, we really, examine how gender dynamics shape up in a story, in issues, in our everyday lives. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you all to think on and share how gender and gender angles and gender dynamics have intersected with your work, or how it has impacted your work. It's a curiosity I came into this panel with, and would love to hear from you all. So Kevin, let's stick with you on this one, and then we'll go around the room.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest blessings I have in my life is that I come from a culture in which folks acknowledge a spectrum of gender. In Samoan, there are what people would consider three genders, right? There are folks who are male, female, and then there are folks who are fa'afafine, which means in the way of a woman, and fa'atane, which means in the way of a man. So inherently there's an acknowledgement and like very specific roles for folks who are transgender. I think part of my thinking in myself has been to develop that into what feels more natural for me. And I've been exploring a terminology called fa'alua, which means in the way of two, in order to understand my gender fluidity from a more indigenous perspective. I think as I'm going through the work, I try my best to be mindful, as I kind of said earlier, of how male presenting I am and what comes along with that. I have access to a lot of spaces that folks don't because of the way that I present. And there are moments in which I'll say something and folks will listen because of the way that I present and sound. So I think it's a difficult balancing act between recognizing where I need to step up and also where I need to step back, because it can be very easy for someone who looks and sounds like me to overpower a space. But I think that poetry especially has been one of these great avenues for me to translate my gender identity into my work and help encourage other folks to find ways to accept who they are. Right? I think there's a lot of time in which like I enter a space and I'm immediately prescribed a gender and I have to start to do the work to undo that. But if I'm able to enter with words and art pieces, then folks have to see that before they see me, right? They have to listen to that before they listen to me. So I think it's all just a roundabout way of saying that, trying to do my best to think on my privilege and to encourage folks that like these identities exist, they've always existed, and we're allowed to embrace them in whatever traditional or non-traditional creative ways we want. We don't have to accept what folks tell us we are, who they tell us we are, but that we're fully capable of building and blending all the blessings we receive to say, this is who I am.
I think when we consider abolition as a movement, it's always important to remember that abolition is a movement led by queer and trans, often femme people of color who are themselves survivors of interpersonal violence. And one of the most powerful things for me is always working with people who live at the intersection of all of these identities. And the deepest desire that we often have is how do we remove this kind of interpersonal harm, both at a systemic level and on a lived level, right? And I think because folks carry these histories of violence and trauma, they're also really committed to changing them. And so movements, I think, mirror those demographic realities and the research, and it also creates this level of dedication and commitment. So I always turn back to my community within the work of uprooting violence. It's always something that I think we see amongst folks who exist in that kind of underestimated, marginalized space.
One of the really significant experiences I've had recently in this work is working intergenerationally across generations, really developing communication and ways to work together that have been mutually beneficial. I think our traditional Japanese and maybe Asian culture, there's this hierarchy of elders and subsequent generations, and working together as partners and learning from one another has been really a powerful thing. And it has brought up issues of gender and privilege that part of our work is to challenge and in our everyday work. And that has been really a powerful lesson for me to see that we can actually make change in our attitudes in the moment that we're having the conversation.
Well, I think for me, I've been just so honored and privileged to work in a number of different communities from early on, working alongside African-American attorneys at the Southern Poverty Law Center, part of MALDEF, and looking at ways in which undocumented Latinx students were discriminated against in terms of higher ed. and then the Japanese Latin American community seeking redress after they too were kidnapped from their homes in Brazil, Panama, Peru, and other countries, and brought to the US and put in incarceration camps. And what I've seen is, these are common struggles. These are universal ways, really of, I would say, dehumanizing peoples. But what's also common is that we all share a humanity, and we all have resisted white supremacy. We will continue to resist white supremacy. We have a resilience across all of our communities when we come together, when we interrogate power. And I think, for me, what's so important is in seeking all of that is the self-actualization that is there, both for us individually as well as for our communities. And I think, what every single one of the folks on the panel has said, that when we come together, we are really able to do that in a way perhaps we haven't always. I think certainly we didn't need colonization to come together, and our communities did have those shared opportunities for redress. And so I think that moving forward, the more we can do that, I think the more successful we're going to be. And I think we're going to be able to know and see not only each other's humanities, but hopefully even our own.
Thank you so much to everyone on this panel for making the time, sharing your energy, your wisdom, and your openness to sharing with us all today. And thank you to everyone tuning in. I would now like to introduce a very special musical performance for AAPI Heritage Month. It is my honor to introduce Shuba.
Hey, what's up? I'm Shuba. I'm a singer, artist, and performer, and I am super excited and super honored to be headlining the 19th Represent Summit this year for AAPI Heritage Month. I am recording this set in the gorgeous Atlantic Studios in Hollywood, and we are so excited to perform some songs for you guys. So this song's not out yet, but it's called Misfit, and it's about feeling like you're out of place everywhere you go. I hope you guys like it. Okay. This is not a pick-me jam or a sad song. I ain't saying that I had it bad, no Rapunzel. I got used to talking to the wall when the room's full. Sorry if this conversation's bland, start the track, cause I don't know how to speak and let this music underneath me. Love to overshare, but then I'm quiet when I should speak. Replay awkward moments in my head, then I can't speak. Do you ever feel like no one likes you? Is that just me? It seems like everyone's got their own lane, and I'm just trying to find my place, but I guess I'm just a misfit. If there's a trend, I always miss it. It's kinda corny to admit this, but I've never been a cool kid. When I try too hard, it's more miss than hit. If my shot ain't broke, then why fix it? I take the norm and then I shift it. So I guess I'm just a misfit. Na 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 na. It seems like everyone's got their own lane, and I'm just trying to find my place, but I guess I'm just a misfit. If there's a trend, I always miss it. It's kinda corny to admit this, but I've never been a cool kid. When I try too hard, it's more miss than hit. If my shot ain't broke, then why fix it? I take the norm and then I shift it. So I guess I'm just a misfit. Na 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 na. Yes, I guess I'm just a misfit. If there's a trend, I always miss it. It's kinda corny to admit this, but I've never been a cool kid. When I try too hard, it's more miss than hit. If my shine ain't broke, then why fix it? I take the norm and then I shift it. So I guess I'm just a misfit. Na 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 na. When I try too hard, it's more missing him. If my shine ain't broke, then why fix it? I take the norm and then I shift it. So I guess I'm just a misfit. Thank you guys so much for having us perform for the 19th Represent Summit this year. It's been a blast. We got Press Camp on his drum kit. We got My Name is Homie on guitar. My name is Shuba. We are filming at Atlantic Studios in Hollywood. Thank you guys so, so much for having us. This last song is called Indian Summer. And my name is Shuba. I took another risk, looking for a high, and I let him get a hit. Now he wants an Indian summer. Ooh, I love to make it drip. No vanilla skies when I kiss him on the lips. Now he wants an Indian summer. Paradox. Henna on my hands and whiskey on the rocks. Baby, sit right where I put you. I've been reading Kama Sutra. If you want to, you can make me wet just like a monsoon. Tell me everything you're gonna do. Run your fingers on my tattoos. Let him feel the hot sun, but he need ice. Yeah, he love my passion. Spice, brown cinnamon, cause he love my brown eyes. Gave it to him once, now he wanna hit twice. Ooh, I took another risk high and I let him get a hit. Now he wants an Indian summer. Ooh, I love to make it drip. No vanilla skies when I kiss him on the lips. Now tight for the chill beats. I'm too fly for the feelsies. He's like fire to the cool breeze. Lose my mind for the 6 feet, cause he can't be the way he grind on the backseat. Up and down till I can't breathe. Pass out when he kiss me. Lose track of time when it's in me. Whoa, I'm supposed to be a lady. They say I'm going crazy. Guess I mess my head up when people were calling me Miss Shady. Just shut your mouth, embrace me, or I'll go Patrick Swayze. I'm either heaven sent or Robin sent from Hades. Carved on the top, not in the plot. I'm gonna rob my body's in hell. Now, angels of God making a mark, looking at me 10 feet when I fell down. If you want our innocence, don't flood our screens with all the shit. You can never tell a brown baddie when it's time to quit. Hey, looking for a high and I let him get a hit. Now he wants an Indian summer. Ooh, I love to make it drip. No vanilla skies when I kiss him on the loose. Now he wants an Indian summer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mel Leonor Barclay, and I'm a politics reporter here at the 19th. Today, we are joined by 2 leaders passionate about maternal health and ending pregnancy-related deaths, an ongoing crisis here in the United States. We are joined by Representative Lauren Underwood, a Democrat from Illinois, who's been a leading advocate on this issue in Congress with her Momnibus, the package of 13 proposals to address health and equity in pregnancy. We're also joined by Christy Turlington Burns, the founder of Every Mother Counts. She's a global advocate for maternal health, and she's been doing that for more than 2 decades. I wanted to start our conversation by recognizing that there's a lot of community work that's going on here to address the issue of maternal mortality. And there are a lot of community-based groups and advocates that are fighting to support pregnant people, a lot of them with limited resources. 2 weeks ago, I got to visit a facility here in Virginia called Urban Baby Beginnings, and there was a lot of hope in that space. There are peanut balls and doulas of color. There was a playroom for toddlers to join their parents during their appointments. And, you know, at the same time, the executive director said, we have really limited resources. When I look at the list of people who have called for services, it's much longer than the number of people that we can serve. Representative Underwood, your Momnibus recognizes the critical work that's already happening in many communities and the resources that could help expand that access. Can you talk about some local or multi-state efforts that give you hope and drive your advocacy for this legislation?
Well, Mel, I'm so encouraged because these organizations are on the ground in every community across the country doing the work, and they have been doing it for years, oftentimes without the benefit of federal support. I'm honored to represent the state of Illinois, and in our state, we have community-based doula groups and midwifery groups. We have organizations that address social determinants of health like housing and nutrition and environmental conditions. And these organizations have literally been working with families long before the federal government was paying attention to our maternal health crisis. And so one of my top priorities as the co-founder and co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus is to ensure that these types of organizations have the funding that they need to provide care and support and services that moms need before, during, and after pregnancy. And for the first time in the federal funding bill that was signed into law this past December, we have a couple $1 million now available for these types of organizations to get funding. Now, we have a bill in the Momnibus called the Kira Johnson Act that we're working to pass to offer like a couple $100 million, right? But this is a good first step to demonstrate the value for communities and how such a program could work at scale.
Yeah. Christy, your organization has turned to grantmaking in the US to help address this country's maternal mortality crisis. You've talked about the surprise that overcomes people abroad when you tell them about the statistics in the US. I'm curious about some of the efforts on the ground here that give you hope. What kinds of efforts at the community level do you think are really critical in the US right now?
Yeah, I mean, to Representative Underwood's point, there have been folks doing this work for many, many, many years. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to meet, work alongside them, and then support their work at the community level while we're waiting for more funds to come in and be allocated to their incredible care. You know, it's been an interesting ride to see the conversation shift from a global one to a more targeted focus here in the US, where we spend more per capita on healthcare than any other nation, and to see the outcomes that we do in this country with the rising maternal mortality rate in the States. It's embarrassing, honestly. And when I have the opportunity to speak outside of the United States, which I do oftentimes, time and time again, people just can't imagine how poorly we are doing as a nation. So I agree. Every Mother Counts is really here to help support that critical work at the front lines across the states in this country. And we've been able to sort of double our impact through investing in those community-led solutions in these past 3 or 4 years, and hope to continue to do so as long as we need to, because those folks really are so committed, and regardless of resources, they're going to do all they can to meet people where they are, families, mothers, birthing people. And so they really need our support in every which way.
Representative Underwood, we've written a lot about your work since you arrived in Congress. You've been advocating for pregnancy justice, and I think your package is really comprehensive. You've always highlighted that it is bipartisan, that it has bipartisan support. A lot of pieces of your Momnibus and the Black Maternal Health Caucus, you always highlight that that has bipartisan membership too. What pieces of your package have the most bipartisan support? And can you also single out for us the pieces that do not, so that it's clear to our audience?
Sure. So the Momnibus is a set of 13 evidence-based bills to comprehensively address the causes of maternal mortality, morbidity, and disparities in the United States. And so from the very beginning, our mission in the Black Maternal Health Caucus was to create a space to elevate this crisis, right, to talk about solutions and for people to be able to come together. So from the very beginning, our caucus has been bipartisan, and now the Black Maternal Health Caucus is one of the largest bipartisan caucuses on Capitol Hill. The Momnibus came out of this group, which was bipartisan from the beginning. And so several bills within the Momnibus do have bipartisan support. So the first that I want to highlight is the Protecting Moms Who Served Act, which I introduced with Congressman Gus Bilirakis. He's a Republican from Florida. And it was the very first Momnibus bill to be signed into law in November 2021. This legislation makes critical investments in maternal health care programs at the Department of Veteran Affairs to make sure that pregnant and postpartum veterans are getting high quality care during and after their pregnancies. And so Congressman Bilirakis and I are teaming up again. We're bringing the team back to reintroduce the Maternal Health for Veterans Act in the Momnibus this Congress. And so it's going to extend funding from the bill that we got signed into law. So that's one. Another bill, the Moms Matter Act, that one's led by Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware. She's a Democrat, and Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania. And this is the legislation that's going to provide funding to address maternal mental health conditions and substance use disorders. And it's so important to talk about this because in my state of Illinois, that's the leading cause of maternal death. We know that there's so many moms that are having challenges in crisis, and yet there's no providers that are skilled in the specialty care in many communities to help a mom in that postpartum period or during pregnancy in a really sensitive, appropriate way. And so we want to make sure that we're not losing moms because of that oversight. The next bill that I want to highlight is the Text to Save Moms Act. And so this one's actually bipartisan in the Senate. So Senator Bob Menendez, who's a Democrat from New Jersey, and Senator Dan Sullivan, a Republican from Alaska, have teamed up on this legislation that would invest in digital tools that we know can play a role in improving maternal health outcomes, particularly in rural and underserved areas. Now, several other provisions of the Momnibus moved through the legislative process with strong bipartisan support last Congress. We're talking about the Maternal Vaccination Act, which passed the House unanimously. And let's just take a step back and think about the politics around vaccines over the last couple of years. And to have a bill with vaccine in the title that can pass the House unanimously just shows you the extent of bipartisan support that we see on this issue. The Data to Save Moms Act, which is to help clean up some of the data that we're getting from states and other jurisdictions, that advanced in the committee with unanimous bipartisan support. So what I want everyone to know is that we can move this legislation forward, and we're committed to doing everything that we can to get these bills to the president's desk this year. Now, do we have some challenges in doing that? Yes. And part of it is that there's a lot of people who, one, don't even know about the maternal health crisis that we're facing, right? They may know of one mom who died or someone who had a difficult experience, but don't understand the systemic nature of the challenge, right? The rural impacts or, the lack of providers and how that's causing moms to die. And so we have to be the ones to extend that hand of partnership to some folks who may not come to us. And that's how we're going to get this done. So I don't think of it, Mel, in terms of policies that have no opportunity for bipartisan support. I think that's the wrong framing. It's just people may not be walking in with a familiarity like they are with, addiction or overdoses or, making sure that apps on our phone are available in rural areas that may be struggling with broadband access. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just to follow up on that, you've talked about, addressing social determinants.
Yes.
And that can be trickier and much more expensive for the federal government. Is that an area where attracting bipartisan support is more difficult?
We were really actually encouraged in our Momnibus. We have a postpartum WIC expansion. So the WIC program, Women, Infant, and Children, currently cuts off 6 months postpartum for mom, 12 months for baby, and we are extending WIC to 24 months for both mom and baby in the Momnibus. That was originally part of the social determinants for moms bill. We split that out into its own bill this year after seeing Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, introduce similar legislation last Congress to call out the need for a WIC expansion, right? So there are a lot of shared values when we talk about these issues. And so what we're trying to do is be as expansive and as inclusive and offer vehicles that can move through the Congress with bipartisan support. So that's how we went from 12 to 13 bills to splitting apart some legislation that we know that there's some interest on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. Christy, for years you've talked about the intersectionality of maternal health and reproductive rights. I was listening to an interview where you were arguing that guaranteeing access to abortions is an important part of reducing maternal deaths. Can you talk more about how these issues are intertwined as you see it, based on what you've seen across the world when it comes to reproductive health, and what worries you when you look at the patchwork of abortion policies in the US?
Absolutely. When I came into this work as a new mother and then as a student of public health, I learned the huge impact that unsafe abortion has globally on moms and women, and the lack of access in so many countries. It's really it's quite something to learn about and see, and then to be living in this country and to see the rollbacks on reproductive rights, especially in this last year post Dobbs. It makes me really concerned because we have made some progress at the global level, and we know how to save women's lives. And to know that there will be these impacts. I mean, it's estimated that globally there will be an increase for maternal mortality because of these setbacks of 21%. Here in this country, the estimates are 33% for Black women. So those are the facts. That's the data that we know. And so for me, we're in this and every mother counts, we're in this position of there's so much to be excited about, and there has been momentum, and yet we can see in the near future that if we don't put a stop to some of these senseless bills that are harmful to women and families, these numbers and the progress made are going to push us back even further. And of course, we have to stay positive in this work. It requires optimism, but it's concerning. Abortion care is maternal health care. And maternal health care includes abortion care. We want to make sure that women have as many options to keep themselves healthy throughout pregnancy, childbirth, and beyond. But if we're not allowing women to have access to quality care all the way through their reproductive lives, we are not seeing them as whole people. And we must do that in order for us all to thrive.
Representative Underwood, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Well, just to point out, the states that we're seeing that are imposing the most severe abortion restrictions are often the states that also have the worst maternal health outcomes already. And so, as Christy outlined, these issues are inextricably linked, and we need policy solutions to both crises, including legislation like the Women's Health Protection Act, which would establish a federal right for healthcare providers to offer abortion care, and a federal right for patients to receive that care free from state restrictions. Now, we also need to pass the Momnibus, right? Which would make sure that everyone receives high quality maternity care and robust support that they need and deserve during and after pregnancy. The Momnibus is not a piece of legislation that necessarily references abortion care. It's not about expanding access to reproductive healthcare services, but from a shared values point of view, we know that birthing people need to have the full range of maternal health care and reproductive health care, right? And so that's really important. And Christy was absolutely right. I just want to make sure that we're understanding that the policy solutions to addressing these are moving through different vehicles. And the Momnibus is really focused on the clinical and non-clinical factors that are driving up our maternal mortality rate and the disparities that we see.
Maternal mortality, if you will, had a moment online after the Met Gala when Serena Williams shared that she was expecting a second child 5 years after she had what was very much a near-death experience, giving birth to her daughter, little Olympia. Representative Underwood, you've talked about the role that implicit bias and structural racism play when it comes to maternal deaths. I know that that's somewhat of a personal experience with a friend who passed away shortly after giving birth. And you've talked about it's not an issue that affects just low-income Black women. Did you see this in practice during your time as a healthcare worker? What policies do you think we need to address this systemic problem?
So we know that there's both implicit bias and explicit bias, aka racism, in the delivery of maternity care specifically, in our healthcare system more broadly, and throughout society, obviously. And so we need comprehensive policies to address all of it. Now, there is funding for implicit bias trainings within the Momnibus, which can be a meaningful tool when implemented consistently and with significant institutional commitment, right? So, for example, a 1-hour webinar once a year, once every 2 years, talking about bias just is not going to cut it, right? We need healthcare systems to be committed to changing the culture within their institutions, and we need providers to be held accountable for completing these trainings consistently. We're seeing Black moms die at a rate that's 3 to 4 times higher than the rate of white moms, regardless of income, education, or any other demographic factor. Racism is the cause, and we need to address racism in our healthcare system head on. But we also need to diversify what we call our perinatal workforce. So that's everybody from our obstetricians and midwives to doulas, lactation consultants, right? Like the whole universe of providers that's taking care of pregnant people in our country, so that every person can receive maternity care from someone that they trust. We want moms to have a choice in providers. And so recent studies have really shown that the risks are especially pronounced for Black moms and babies. And so within the Momnibus, we have a bill, for example, called the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act, to address things like air pollutants and extreme heat and other climate change related risks through through community-based investments. Now, I bring that up because we know that systemic challenges can manifest through social determinants, right? Like redlining is an issue. So then, certain communities have to live in certain neighborhoods based on historic redlining trends in their cities, and then they're having negative maternal and infant health outcomes. We need to be specific about our solutions to address some of these societal challenges or harms that have been imposed over the years. And we do that within the Momnibus. We cannot solve our nation's maternal health crisis if we don't tackle the root causes of racism that are driving these deaths and disparities.
Thank you for putting that so clearly. Christy, I saw you nodding pretty energetically, and I know that when it comes to training healthcare workers and a wide range of them, that's an issue that your organization has been working on for a long time. Can you tell me about the importance of this diverse array of workers? Like the representative just mentioned, it's not just OBs, it's nurses, doulas, midwives. How does that serve pregnant patients, and how does that reduce risk as you've seen it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the sort of maternity care ecosystem is far broader than most people realize, and to make midwifery care available to more people as an option for low-risk pregnancies it should be one of those, you know, choices that women have going in to this experience. And as well, doulas. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about doula care and a lot of research and evidence that's been produced to be able to back up that care. However, unfortunately, we don't quite have the structure for reimbursement for that care that actually helps support mothers and families to the point that the outcomes are so much more improved. So we're really trying to amplify the healthcare worker sort of models that are proven to have better outcomes, provide that more holistic, compassionate care that every patient deserves and should have at their accessibility, and to also advocate on their behalf so that they are compensated fairly and equitably, and that they are reimbursed, so that we're having this be a line of a pipeline that can also be built and grown, right? That we know the demand is there. We know the populations who are suffering most from poor outcomes. And if we can train more folks to be able to be there in the communities to serve them with culturally congruent care, with respectful care, we know that we'll see a huge change. So it's very, very important. It's part of why one of the many reasons why we're so excited about the Momnibus, because it really calls out these options and helps us to build the case and continue to create demand for this kind of care and this level of quality care.
This next question is for both of you. Christy, it's been 20 years since the birth of your daughter and the postpartum complications that you faced at that time. What changes have you seen since you started doing this work? What's giving you hope and momentum?
It's still shocking to me to hear 20 years, but yes, it's nearly 20 years since my daughter was born and I experienced a postpartum hemorrhage. When I started doing this work, I would say often that I really hoped by the time my daughter was even thinking about one day becoming or not choosing motherhood for herself, that this issue would be, it would be what we mostly imagine that it is, right? Most American people or most people around the world do not know that women are dying at the rates that they are. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. I mean, I'm hoping that she's a ways away from making that kind of decision for herself anyway, but it just shows me that in 20 years, there's just still so much work to be done. The most positive thing is honestly the fact that this is a conversation that we're having. I'd say in the last 5 years in particular, it's just the momentum around this topic with stories like Serena Williams, Beyonce, and so many others who are not world famous, who have been sharing their stories widely, and that those stories have been amplified to help to build the case for why this is so important and it needs to be prioritized. Again, with the leadership of Representative Underwood and Representative Adams, they have been so instrumental in building this incredible momentum and, inspiring so many of us to do all that we can to stand together to demand better. And then this administration, the leadership that's been shown, the vice president and so many other members of this cabinet who have really prioritized maternal health and have put themselves out there just to keep this issue top of mind for all of us. That's what gives me the most hope. That's what I'm really most excited about with this reintroduction of the Momnibus. I know that we can do this, and I'm not going to give up until we get there.
Representative Underwood, if my math is correct, it's been about 15 years since you wrote a college thesis about pregnancy-related deaths. In the time since, what have you seen change? What hasn't changed enough?
Well, we know that, the crisis is getting worse. Unfortunately, the maternal mortality rate in the year I was first elected to Congress was about 17 deaths per 100,000 live births. In 2021, the rate was approximately 33 deaths per 100,000 live births, which means our nation's maternal mortality rate increased by nearly 90% from 2018 to 2021. But there's hope, right? Because CDC has told us that more than 4 in 5 pregnancy-related deaths in the United States are preventable. And so we can end this crisis if we have the will to advance a solution that meets the scale of the problem. And the Momnibus is that solution. Now, another change that I've seen is the increasing recognition for the need for this legislation. So when I first introduced the Momnibus in the 116th Congress with then Senator, now Vice President Kamala Harris, we had 23 original co-sponsors in the House. We came back in the 117th Congress with Senator Cory Booker, and we got up to 82 co-sponsors in the House, right? When we introduced this bill in May for the 118th Congress, we had 181 original co-sponsors in the House, right? So we're working with a really of members of Congress, and then these great partners like Christy and Every Mother Counts and other organizations that have just been leading the way and increasing our cultural awareness of both the problem and solutions. I know that we're going to be able to get this legislation across the finish line and to the president's desk this year. We obviously have to, but what I will say is this: as we've been talking about the scope of the problem, we've also been lifting up solutions beyond legislative solutions, right? So with every film that Christy produces, right, we're talking about the impact of birth workers. We're talking about the impact of doula care. We're talking about community-led, women-led solutions to saving each other. And that is such an empowering message, right? So we're not talking about something where we're waiting for someone to be benevolent, to just turn their attention to us and then save us, right? We're talking about solutions that our community as pregnant people have identified as the solutions that we want that will work to save lives. And so I've also seen that discussion really advance in a positive way. And so, I think that, Christy used the word momentum, and I think that's the exact right word to describe where we are right now. A solution is in sight. It's not even far on the horizon, and we just have to get there.
Well, thank you so much. I hope that this conversation contributes to the cultural awareness that we're talking about. And I do appreciate your time today and all the time that you've already dedicated to this issue.
Thanks, Mel.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to you, Mel, and the rest of today's moderators and speakers. I also want to extend another round of thanks to those who have made our 4th annual 19th Represents Summit possible, including founding sponsors, the National Women's Law Center and the Stardust Fund, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation and the Tory Burch Foundation. We'd also like to thank our national media partner, The Washington Post, as well as our local media partners, Block Club Chicago, CityCast Chicago, City Bureau, and the Chicago Independent Media Alliance. And finally, our academic partner, Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. And of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in. Be sure to come back tomorrow. This time it'll be 3 p.m. Eastern for our final day of Summit. We'll be talking about gender equality and economic mobility with Second Gentleman of the United States, Douglas Emhoff, entrepreneur and financial expert Vivian Tu, and many more. The conversations will be live in Chicago. If you're in the area and would like to join in person, there's still time to register. Visit summit.19thnews.org to sign up. We'll see you tomorrow.